I'm not sure what hurt more, the words themselves, or the way he laughed when he said them. "It's done, Janelle," my stepfather told me. "I sold your father's cabin. You can't stop it." In that moment, I felt something inside me split open, like he hadn't just sold a piece of land, but ripped the last piece of my father out of my hands. The end of my shift wrapped around me like a damp blanket, heavy with the chill of Juneau's sea air. Salt still clung to my sleeves as I stepped into the break room, grateful for a moment away from the constant chatter of radios and the bright glare of radar screens. I hadn't even settled onto the chair when my phone buzzed across the table. Richard, Stepdad. The name alone carried a familiar weight, but I answered anyway, expecting something routine, another small demand wrapped in forced civility. What came instead slid under my skin like a blade. He said the cabin in Mendocino was gone, sold, final. His tone was disturbingly casual, almost upbeat, as if he were talking about clearing out a garage, not erasing the last piece of my father still anchored to this world. For a moment, all I heard was the soft hum of the vending machine and my own breath thinning in my chest. That cabin held my childhood, summers by the water, and the quiet steadiness my father carried everywhere he went. Losing it didn't feel like losing property. It felt like losing him again. My hand tightened around the edge of the table, grounding myself as everything inside me slipped downward, slow and bruising. Richard ended the call with a finality that left no room for error. I stared out the fogged window at the pale morning outside, feeling the decision settle in me with unmistakable clarity. I needed to go back to Mendocino. Everything began there. The mist thickened as I drove deeper into Mendocino, curling through the redwoods like it had been sitting there for years, waiting for me to come back. The air smelled of wet bark and cold soil, and for a brief moment I let myself believe the lake would look the way it had when my father was still alive. But that hope snapped the second I caught sight of a warm glow leaking through the trees. A light was on inside the cabin. Then came the sharp, steady crack of a hammer. I pulled up slowly, my headlights sweeping across a figure on the roof. A man I had never seen adjusted a row of shingles, pausing only when he noticed me. He waved in an easy, neighborly way, like I was returning to a place I'd abandoned long ago. Inside, he showed me the sales contract, spreading it across the kitchen counter as if he were giving a tour of his own home. Everything looked polished and official, multiple signatures, notarization, county stamps, everything except the one signature that mattered, mine. He explained, kindly enough, that my father had authorized my mother's husband to act on behalf of the family. My stomach tightened. Around us, the cabin looked familiar, yet wrong. The doorway still bore the faint carving my father and I etched together, J plus Dad, summer 2004. Its edges softened by time, but the rest of the room had been stripped of him. His gear was shoved into a lopsided stack in the corner, as if someone wanted it gone but didn't care where it landed. When I confronted my mother later that afternoon, she admitted she'd signed paperwork without reading it. She kept saying she thought it was just financial restructuring, something Richard told her was necessary. Her voice shook with guilt, but that didn't dull the sting. She hadn't meant to help him, yet she'd done exactly that, needing answers. I drove straight to the county recorder's office. The clerk pulled up the digital file, frowning as he clicked through the history. The cabin's record had been edited months earlier, only once, and the employee responsible had resigned with no stated reason. A chill settled in my spine. This wasn't coincidence. Someone had cleared a path long before I arrived. Night wrapped around the cabin as I opened the metal box my father left me. The hinges groaned softly, releasing the scent of old paper and lake air. Inside, under folded receipts and photographs, lay a document I had never taken seriously until now, a supplemental clause, my father's handwriting strong and unmistakable. The cabin could never be sold without my written consent. The clarity of his intention struck deep. This clause alone destroyed the legitimacy of everything Richard had handed the buyer, yet when I checked the county system again, the clause was nowhere to be found. Not misfiled, erased. I examined the rest of the documents, fingers tracing the faint rings of dried droplets on several pages. My father must have written them by the lake, early in the morning when the mist still hovered low. That thought cut deeper than I expected, hoping for support. I brought the documents to my mother's attorney. He barely skimmed them before insisting everything was proper and urging me not to dig further. His dismissal was too quick, his tone too controlled, like someone guarding more than just legal advice. Walking out of his office, the pieces finally connected in a way I couldn't ignore. The missing clause, the edited county record, the attorney's rehearsed calm. The cabin hadn't been lost through carelessness. Someone had been wiping the trail clean, step by step, long before I ever returned. The evening fog rolled through Mendocino as I walked up to Richard's porch, the scent of damp wood settling thick in the air. My thoughts felt sharper than they had in days, pulled tight by everything I'd uncovered. When he opened the door with that familiar, condescending half-smile, it felt like stepping back into a version of myself I no longer recognized. I didn't bother with niceties. I asked how the cabin had been sold, why the county records were altered, who had authority to sign anything at all. He brushed it off, claiming the family needed the money and insisting I hadn't lived there in years, as if absence erased blood or memory. I pulled out the bank records I'd printed, the withdrawals marked with assisted signatures. My father's name was there, but the handwriting wasn't his. Richard dismissed it instantly, calling it a clerical mistake. But the split-second flicker in his eyes told me more than his words ever could. I went to my mother next. She stood in the kitchen clasping her hands like she was bracing against a storm. When I asked why she'd signed anything without reading it, she whispered that she only wanted to avoid conflict. That stung far worse than Richard's lies. She'd chosen silence over honesty. And that silence had cost me more than she could imagine. Hoping for clarity, I confronted her attorney. He insisted the documents were legitimate and told me to stop pushing. Something in his delivery felt rehearsed. A quick background search later confirmed the reason years earlier. He'd handled private debt work for Richard. My mother hadn't been protected, she'd been steered. By the time I met with the buyer again, exhaustion pressed hard behind my eyes. He looked over the supplemental clause I'd found and said he couldn't move forward if anything was concealed. The concern in his face told me he believed me. That moment of validation was brief. Later that night, an email from the Rescue Council accused me of instability, dangerous behavior, and mental unfitness. The timing made the culprit obvious. Richard wasn't just trying to keep the cabin, he was coming for everything anchored to my name. As I shut my laptop, one truth settled heavily over me. This wasn't about property anymore. This was war. Rain swept across the lake that night, tapping against the windows like a warning. I stood on the porch, gripping my flashlight, trying to steady the unease twisting inside me. The buyer's message came through. First, he wanted to pause the transaction because something felt off. Moments later, Richard called. His voice was sharper now, stripped of that smug patience. He accused me of tearing the family apart, but underneath the anger was fear. If the sale stopped, the cover he'd built would collapse. The buyer then forwarded me another email, this one from Richard, claiming I was unstable and urging him to distance himself before legal trouble followed. It was a calculated strike meant to isolate me. Later, inside the dim cabin, the buyer admitted he had spent years counseling rescue personnel. He could see I wasn't unstable. I was grieving and focused. Two things Richard had twisted deliberately. He pointed to a small clause in the contract stating the sale relied on a specific version of the county record. That version no longer existed. The record had been altered illegally, rendering the sale invalid. Then came the next blow. The Rescue Oversight Office called to say multiple complaints had been filed about me. Richard wasn't retaliating, he was dismantling the life I'd built. The buyer produced another document he'd pulled. The cabin had been used as collateral 3 years earlier. Richard had mortgaged my father's cabin behind everyone's back. And when I confronted my mother again, she confessed she'd known, but kept quiet to avoid another argument. I left her house in the rain, understanding finally that no one inside those walls was on my side. What came next? I'd face alone, armed only with the truth. Rain hammered the Mendocino mountains that night. washing over the redwoods until the road shimmered like black glass. I left the cabin shaken from another argument with my mother, her voice still insisting Richard only wanted stability. The storm blurred the road ahead, and all I wanted was a hot shower and silence long enough to think. Then a pair of headlights exploded in my mirror. A gray pickup shot from the trees and clung to my bumper. When I slowed, it slowed. When I accelerated, it matched me beat for beat. My pulse tightened as the wind pushed against the car, the fog swallowing everything beyond the beam of my headlights. On a narrow ridge, the truck clipped the back of my car, forcing my wheels toward the edge. Gravel scattered down the drop below. I fought the wheel, flicking my high beams in desperation, but the truck didn't break off. It wanted me gone. The road widened at a curve, and the pickup skidded sideways, blocking my path. I slammed my brakes, the squeal echoing through the forest. The door opened, and my half-brother stepped out, shaking, face drawn with exhaustion. He told me I needed to stop, that my digging was making things worse for everyone. When I pressed him, he broke. Richard had forced him to sign bank papers he didn't understand, threatening him with eviction and false accusations. Then he revealed the deeper truth: the cabin had been used as collateral for a large private debt. Richard was drowning, and the only lifeline he saw was selling the cabin at any cost. Before leaving, he warned me in a whisper that Richard was past reason now, too desperate to fear consequences. As the pickup disappeared back into the storm, the truth settled cold and heavy. This was no longer a legal fight. It had become something far more dangerous. Morning light filtered through the redwoods when I returned to the cabin with the buyer. The storm had passed, but the stillness inside felt unnervingly deliberate, as if the cabin knew what we were about to find. He paused in the living room, tapping a section of the floor where the echo rang hollow. We lifted the plank, revealing a small rusted safe buried beneath the boards. The latch had already been broken long ago. Inside, wrapped in fading paper, lay my father's journal, old bank slips, and a photocopy of the missing supplemental clause. The first page of the journal caught my breath. My father had predicted this, that someone close might one day try to pry the cabin from our hands. He wrote about Richard's early attempts to access his finances and his decision to create a hidden addendum with an attorney he trusted. We discovered that attorney had died years earlier. His office dissolved, his files scattered into archives no one ever reopened. The clause hadn't disappeared by accident. It had simply never been transferred when the system changed. The buyer became more than an observer then. He traced the property logs and uncovered the former county clerk tied to shady record alterations. He pointed out the contract's dependence on a land record version that no longer legally existed, making the sale void. As we stepped outside, I noticed fresh tire tracks matching the truck from the night before. Richard had been there, close enough to watch. I held my father's journal against my chest, feeling the weight of truth settle into my hands. It was finally time to expose everything. The Mendocino courtroom felt colder than the storm outside, its neon lights humming above benches packed with locals hungry for answers about the cabin dispute. I sat in the front row with my father's journal clutched in my hands, not out of fear, but because I could feel the moment tightening around me, the sense that what happened here would finally drag the truth into daylight. My attorney began by projecting two versions of the land records. First came the untouched original, then the version that had been altered. The differences were glaring. Entire sections rewritten as if someone had tried to rearrange history. Murmurs swelled across the room while Richard sat stiffly, his complexion draining even as he forced a calm expression. When it was my turn, I read from my father's journal his fear that the cabin would be taken, his decision to hide a supplemental clause, his suspicion that someone close had tried to access his accounts. The handwriting expert confirmed the entries belonged to him, and a sharp ripple of reaction shifted through the courtroom. My mother was called next. Her voice shook as she admitted she'd signed documents without realizing what Richard intended. The confession cracked something open. Grief and relief tangled in a way I couldn't untangle. Then the buyer stood and calmly explained that the sale depended on a version of the land record that no longer legally existed, making the transaction invalid. Silence swept the room. Cornered, Richard erupted, accusing me of plotting against the family. He didn't see the final blow coming, evidence tying the altered records to a clerk previously investigated for fraud. During the recess, Richard ran straight into the redwoods. Deputies called for backup, and when the sheriff turned to me for guidance, I understood the chase wasn't over. Not until the truth was. Night settled over the redwoods like a heavy curtain, the kind that swallowed sound and turned every shadow into a warning. Flashlights sliced through the darkness as deputies spread out across the forest, their voices echoing faintly whenever they called Richard's name. I broke away from the group and followed the narrow path toward the lake, my boots sinking into damp soil. It was the place my father always retreated to when he needed clarity. And somehow I knew that if Richard stopped running, it would be there. The closer I drew to the water, the more the air shifted thick, cold, still. My heartbeat slowed, steady but heavy, as if preparing me for a truth I'd avoided for far too long. When I stepped onto the rocky shoreline, the beam of my flashlight caught a hunched figure perched on a boulder. Richard! His shoulders trembled, his face bleached pale under the light. He didn't stand or try to run again. He just stared at me with a mixture of fear, shame, and something almost like relief. He muttered that I didn't understand, but the words spilled out before I could answer. He owed a massive debt to private lenders, the kind of people no one reasoned with. The cabin had been his only escape route. He confessed to everything, using it as hidden collateral, forcing my brother to sign documents he didn't comprehend, altering county records, siphoning money from my father's accounts. Even sending letters meant to dismantle my career piece by piece, each admission struck with the weight of a blow, unraveling whatever pieces of family I still believed existed. Then he crumpled under the weight of his own downfall. He whispered that he had always hated how my father carried himself, calm and capable, even in death outshining the man who replaced him. Hearing it out loud froze me. It wasn't remorse. It was jealousy rooted, festering, finally exposed. I asked what he planned to do at the cabin before fleeing. A strange laugh escaped him, brittle and exhausted. He said he intended to burn everything: papers, records, the cabin itself, level it to ash so nothing could tie back to him, not even the memories my father left behind. Before the words fully settled, the sheriff and 2 deputies emerged out of the dark. Richard didn't resist when they cuffed him, his head bowed, movements limp, as if the confession had emptied whatever fight he had left. I watched him being led away with a hollowness that surprised me. No triumph, no vindication, just the quiet ache of something irreparably broken. The damage he caused didn't disappear with the click of handcuffs. The cabin was safe now. But as I stood by the lake, mist curling above the water, the forest breathing around me, I knew this night wasn't an ending. It was only the threshold of what came next. A week after the final hearing, Mendocino felt gentler, as if the forest itself had exhaled. Morning sunlight shimmered across the lake like scattered silver, and the cabin finally quiet, scrubbed clean of Richard's shadow, felt like it belonged to the world my father loved, not the chaos it had endured. I stood on the porch with a warm cup between my hands, listening to the soft beat of wings cutting through the trees. The air carried only pine, sun, and stillness. The court's decision had been clear. The cabin was legally and irrevocably mine. Richard was found guilty of fraud, witness intimidation, and record tampering. The lawyer who enabled him was now under investigation. My brother, pressured into complicity, was officially absolved. When my mother apologized through tears, I told her I needed time because time was the only way to rebuild anything honestly. It wasn't distance out of anger, it was a boundary I should have drawn years ago. Later that morning, the cabin's would-have-been buyer, the retired psychologist, who had become an unlikely anchor, walked up the porch steps. He studied the familiar view and asked what I planned to do with the place now that it was mine again. I looked out at the lake, its surface calm and wide, and said I wanted it to become a space where rescue workers could breathe, recover, and find steadiness after everything the job takes from them. A small retreat, nothing elaborate, just a place where the world quiets enough to let someone feel whole again. He offered to help, no hesitation, only sincerity. When he left, I opened my father's journal one last time, near the end. In his steady handwriting, he had written that the cabin was meant to be where I found myself when life pulled me too far from center. Reading it, I realized how strange and fitting it was that everything I'd endured had led me straight back here. What returned to me wasn't just a property, it was my father's intention. Restored. I placed the journal in the new safe, closed the door, and turned the key. The soft click settled into the room like a final punctuation mark. Stepping outside again, the lake opened in front of me, bright and quiet, and for the first time in years, my feet felt firmly on the ground. I wasn't standing to defend anything anymore. I was standing to begin,